Welcome, and thanks to all of you for coming. I'm Brad Graham, the co-owner of Politics and Prose, along with my wife, Lisa Muscatine, and it's just so wonderful to see such a large turnout, which in itself is a tribute to Mark and all that he meant to so many people. Since his passing, we here at P&P have received an outpouring of condolences filled with reminiscences of Mark and stories reflecting just how appreciated he was. A funeral service was held for him 3 weeks ago on the north side of Chicago in the neighborhood where he grew up and where his mom, his sisters and brothers, and other members of his extended family still live. Hundreds attended, filling a Catholic church, and it was quite a lovely and moving service that highlighted Mark's love of literature and his very generous spirit in sharing this love with so many others. Since Mark's life was focused here for the past nearly 25 years, and many couldn't make it to Chicago, we also wanted to host this memorial event for him at Politics and Prose. We're honored that I think about 10 members of Mark's family have come into town for this, including his mom, Lou, who's right here. And also here is Barbara Meade, P&P's co-founder, who along with the other Barbara, who along with the other founder of P&P, Carla Cohen, enticed Mark to move to Washington to work at the bookstore. You'll be hearing from others who knew Mark in various ways, but let me just take a moment to recognize those on P&P staff who organized this evening's event. The foursome of Carolyn, our COO, and Wendy, our marketing director, Patricia, our events director, and Susan, our events advisor, took the lead in coordinating the speakers and readers. Mary, in marketing, put the slideshow together and designed and printed the program. And Andras, our music expert, put together this evening's playlist, and we greatly appreciate their efforts.
Good evening, everybody. I'm Lisa Muscatine. I'm co-owner of Politics and Prose with Brad, my husband. And we're all here for a sad occasion, but we want to make it a celebration because there is much to celebrate in the life of Mark Laframboise and also his incredible tenure here at Politics and Prose. And I think what's really astounding about this gathering that's so heartwarming is that, and it shows you just how beloved and respected Mark was in the book industry. This is not just a gathering of customers, which it could be. It's not just a gathering of fellow booksellers, which it could be. It's not just a gathering of representatives from the publishing industry, which it could be. And it's not just a representative of local authors who he championed over and over again, but it could be. But this gathering represents all of those different parts of the publishing world that Mark had a connection to, that he had engaged with, and that had so much love and respect for him. And I think all of us here tonight know what it was like to know Mark in his love of books, and also to be touched, as Brad said, by this incredible generosity of his spirit. I just want to say a couple of words about my own relationship with Mark. When Brad and I assumed ownership of the store about 11 years ago with Barbara and Carla, big shoes to fill, I might add. And Mark was, first of all, one of the people we knew we had to keep. He was the chief buyer. He was not the chief buyer. Barbara was the chief buyer. And we wanted to make sure that the store was going to stay on secure footing. And so the first thing we did was have lunch with Mark and insist and pray and plead with him to stay. And we also elevated him to be the chief buyer, which of course so many of you know how well he did that job and how hard a job it is. But the first time I really talked to Mark after we became owners, he was at his desk in the fiction room, where I'm sure many of you have happened upon him. And I was walking to the office, which goes right past his desk, and he looked very exuberant. So I stopped and asked him what was going on, and he was just so excited about his book group meeting that night. And so I said, well, what book are you guys reading this month? And he said, we're reading White Tiger by Aravinda Diga. And I happened to have read it. And I said, oh, that's great. I love that book. And he said, yeah, sometimes for this book group, we actually cook and do meals that are sort of related to the book. And I said, oh, are you going to be having Indian food, South Asian food? And he said, yeah. And then he said, and let me show you this cookbook. And he went and picked a cookbook that was Indian food. And the next thing I know, we're talking about samosas and dal and all sorts of other things, salag paneer, whatever. And I thought, wow, he's just not about books. He's also about food. Well, it turns out he was about those things with a kind of purity of passion that I think is really rare. Mark loved books, he loved cooking, he loved food, and he loved sports. And those became the three connections that I had to him. And I would sit by his desk or walk by his desk, and we were destined to talk about one, two, or all three of those subjects. And so I just loved the idea of bumping into him at his desk, because it was bound to be an interesting conversation. And by the way, he read 2 books a week. So I didn't have a lot of new things to offer in these daily conversations, but he was on to the next book within a day or two. In the years after, and Mark was chief buyer at this point, I decided I should learn a little bit about buying. And I thought it can't be that hard, right? So I asked Mark if he would teach me, and he handed over one of the publishing houses for me to be the buyer for. So he tutored me, and I realized this is not a science. This is an art. Maybe a little bit of science, but it's a lot of art. And I hadn't really appreciated what was required until Mark became my tutor. And he, again, his generosity of spirit, his excitement that I was interested, his willingness to take it on with me. And then I would be amazed. We'd come across a book that was coming out, 6 months later, and he'd say, oh yeah, now that guy wrote 3 other books. So this one was good. This one wasn't so good. But on page 362 of that one, and it was just his breadth of knowledge, and the amount he immersed himself in these books was so apparent. And his repartee with reps, you have to develop, and the reps who are here can attest to this, he had to develop a relationship, because there is that funny little dance that reps and bookstore people do about how many books do you want? I think you should get more. No, I'm not sure our customers really want that book. And Mark was, of course, so skilled and expert at that. And then lastly, just the joy that he showed whenever a customer wanted a book. And I'm sure all of us who've worked here remember him, the image of Mark racing across the floor to grab a book from the bookshelf and put it in someone's hands. And it was just the purity of his joy at doing it, the purity of joy at reading a book he liked, the purity of joy at having that little dance with the reps was just always apparent. The other thing that Mark and I got to do that I feel so grateful for was we sort of had a road show where, I don't know how many years ago, he and I started doing a holiday video with our favorite 5 or 6 books. And we would go downstairs and our videographer, Tom, would video us, and we would just talk about our favorite books. And I'm like, I don't think anybody's going to really watch this, but it was so fun. And listening again to Mark talk about the books with just this sheer joy at the protagonists and the heroes and the villains and the plot and the story. Nothing made him happier. And that happiness was so infectious on the rest of us who worked alongside of him. My last conversation with Mark, predictably, was by his desk. And again, we exchanged thoughts about the books that we were reading. I can't remember, unfortunately. I'm sure he would remember which ones we talked about. But then we turned to sports, which we often did. And I was, I think, at that moment, obsessing about the U.S. Open tennis tournament. Mark, it turned out, was following every excruciating detail of the women's college softball tournament. Now, I thought to myself, why is he interested in softball, women's softball? Not that I have anything against women's softball. I think it's great. And then I realized it was vintage Mark. It was the Mark we all knew, especially outwardly, this enthusiastic, engaged in a story, engaged in people who were, again, protagonists or rising to the challenge or failing at the challenge. And it was a storyline that he just wanted to follow. And it didn't really matter whether it was women's softball or books or food or anything else. And again, he was just so generous in his spirit of sharing those loves that he had so deeply and so purely with the rest of us. So I just want to close by saying, first of all, thank you all for being here to share in your memories of Mark. I just am personally so grateful to him for making me a much better reader, a semi-decent book buyer, a much more skilled bookseller, and most of all, a much better person. So thank you all for being here.
My name is Matt Laframboise. I'm the younger brother of Mark and the third of the four boys. Mark was the oldest boy. On behalf of our family, I want to thank you all for coming, and thank you to Brad, Lissa, Ron, and the rest of the staff for hosting this beautiful memorial honoring our brother Mark. The comments left by Mark's friends and customers on the Politics and Prose Facebook page has brought my mom and all of us a great deal of comfort. We read them all, and it's also comforting for her to know that she raised a man who was loved by so many. They talk about standing on the shoulders of those that came before you. I'm not sure who they are, but I've heard they say it. And because of who Mark was, me and my siblings stood tall on his shoulders. We studied his cues on how to be cool, and how to be popular and well-liked, and how to do well in school. And how to be open and honest about your feelings, and be passionate about the things you think are really great. He also taught me that it's okay to rebel once in a while, but not too much. And as I got older, I also took my political cues from Mark, who always thought of the plight of others and the need to stick up and fight for the underdog. But I was so receptive to Mark and what Mark had to say because his side of the argument just always made more sense to me. We could be talking about anything from food to politics to music, and I always came away from our conversation with a changed viewpoint or an intense curiosity to find out more about what he just dropped on me. Mark related to all his siblings this easily and naturally, and he broadened all of our horizons. But my earliest memories of Mark are always around music. With all the talk about his love for books, his love for music has been overlooked. Mark was 7 years older than me, and as a kid I used to love hanging out upstairs in his bedroom, especially when he wasn't home. That you never knew what you'd find if you snooped hard enough. But mostly I listened to his records and looked through his sketchbooks and issues of the National Lampoon. That he had all the best albums of the day: Pink Floyd, Wish You Were Here, Lynyrd Skynyrd, One More from the Road, George Carlin, Class Clown, just to name a few. But his sweet spot was Bob Dylan, The Grateful Dead, Bob Dylan, John Prine, and Bob Dylan. Mark didn't put too many people on a pedestal. It wasn't in his nature. But he idolized Dylan. And I can say with pretty good confidence that no other artist had a bigger influence on him. Mark was my mom's own blue-eyed son, and as a youth, I didn't see the greatness of these artists, but as I got older, I soon realized that Mark's taste in music was better than 99% of what was on the radio. Mark was a big influence in many ways, but no more so than when it came to music. Without Mark, I probably wouldn't know who Townes Van Zandt was, and that would be a shame. And because he turned me on to John Prine, we were left with such nuggets as, "Buddy, when you're dead, you're a dead peckerhead." So it was then that I began to see and appreciate the depth of Mark, a guy not concerned with what those in the mainstream were doing or listening to, but a guy that knew that being original and true to yourself is the best way to set yourself apart. I'm glad we talked about sports earlier because I wasn't sure if I should include his football, but we looked up to Mark for a lot of things. And football, as you know, is a game of inches, usually won or lost in the trenches. And that's where Mark toiled and excelled as an offensive guard, doing the unsung dirty work, while the running backs ran through the holes he created. But that was okay with Mark, who didn't care much about personal glory, that he embraced his role on the team and the importance of it, and was a team first guy all the way. But what made him great on the gridiron was his ability to reach deeper down into his guts than his opponent could and move him backwards off the ball. He played the game at full speed and with a mean streak that subsided after the final whistle. We also envied Mark for his professional success. They say that if you do what you love, you'll never work a day in your life. So we were envious that he got to have spirited conversations about books and authors with other smart, passionate book lovers. We envied the heck out of that. But what we looked up to most about Mark, without a doubt, was his God-given ability to create. To draw, to paint, to sculpt. He could effortlessly capture motion and emotion, but it wasn't just how well he could draw, but what he chose to draw that really captivated me. He would conjure up these strange and fantastical characters that were so eerily drawn that you could see their stories written in the lines that Mark drew. They were moody and atmospheric, all right. There was the seething samurai, or the dueling Old West sheriff, shooting from the hip with a puff of smoke at the end of his Colt 45. These were sketches that I saw in his sketchbook, just to make that clear. There was also the haggard hobo with the grizzled face, or the sad sideshow circus freak, smiling full of grace. And one of my favorites, the guilty man, glowering from atop the gallows, his hat in his hand, his neck in a noose, with the hangman to his side with his hand on the lever. I'm sorry to sound so dramatic, but his sketches were always packed with drama, like something bad was always about to happen. The samurai's sword was raised, but had not yet fallen. The trapdoor beneath the man's feet had not yet swung open, and the sheriff's bullet had not yet reached its target. Or was it the other way around? Was it the sheriff's time to put his guns in the ground? All Mark did was set the table and the mood, and then let us connect the dots as to what might be going on in the pictures. And it's been 40 years since I've seen these sketches. They're long gone, but they become a part of me, branded into my memory, still informing my tastes in movies, music, and books. All of his sketches were little stories, and if not mini masterpieces, then micro masterpieces in my eyes. And it was an interesting way in which to get to know Mark, aside from the traditional ways in which we related and got along. It was a peek behind the curtain, into his mind, or his imagination, and it was a neat way to see what made him tick. What does he find interesting? What's on his mind? And who are his heroes? Last page. And as a 12-year-old kid, getting a glimpse of all this was pretty extraordinary. To live in Mark's head, that even if just for a while, was exciting, thrilling, and exhilarating, especially at this time of his life when he was 19 or 20. I was 12, and his creativity was just brimming, burning, and unbridled. And it opened up new worlds to me, because up until then, I had mainly subsisted on a steady diet of Popeye and the Three Stooges. So I loved getting lost in those sketchbooks and going to places that I didn't even know existed. And I loved the darkness that Mark was able to capture in all his drawings. Mark definitely had an edge to him, and I thought that was cool. And to this kid, his talent was so obvious and so immense. It was like he had magic coming from his fingers. I couldn't believe that he wasn't laying on his back somewhere painting a ceiling, or away at some faraway art school, hammer and chisel in hand, with a hunk of marble in front of him. He may not have been Michelangelo, but we thought he was. That in our family, we all saw that sort of greatness in him. And how special his talents were. And we knew it would just be a matter of time before the world saw it too. But as the years went by, and he went from his 20s through his 30s and well into his 40s, and me ever closer behind in age, I think to myself, okay, he's read enough masterpieces, but when is he going to paint his masterpiece? We're all running out of time here. And those long black clouds, if not gathering, are starting to form. But it's hard to make a living as an artist, to spend a lifetime creating, no matter the skill level or amount of natural talent. Our family knew that. So when Mark left Chicago, we were all bummed out because the house on Morris Avenue wouldn't be the same without him. But we knew that as an artist or as a writer, that sometimes you have to leave the warm confines of home, spread your wings, and all that. We knew he needed grist for the mill to feed his desire for new experiences. And after all, if he was going to paint the next masterpiece or write the next great American novel, then he was going to have to find something or some feeling worth exalting. And as a family, we all understood that, and we supported him. And so we are glad, relieved actually, that his personal journey, following a trail of books over 6 crooked highways, led him here to Politics and Prose, where he found his tribe, a group of like-minded human beings, warm and beautiful people that knew him and cared about him, and who nourished him intellectually, emotionally, and spiritually. If he couldn't be home in Chicago with us, then we are happy that he could be in a place like this, a store like this, with people like you. And there's one last thing which has dawned on me since his passing, and that's the fact that Mark did indeed paint his masterpiece. An incredibly rich composition, and we were all right there with him, and it still sounds smooth like a rhapsody. Thank you.
Thank you, Matt. That was incredibly powerful. I'm Susan Call. I am currently the events advisor here at Politics and Prose. And if I was ever in doubt when it came to scheduling an event, I would ask Mark, why was I having trouble finding our history of our past events with Cormac McCarthy? I asked him this summer, thinking that we might want to schedule something for his forthcoming book. He doesn't tour. He's famously reclusive, Mark told me, without making me feel foolish for not knowing something I should have known. My last official work exchange with him had to do with asking him how many signed copies of Patti Smith we wanted for stock, and he told me 100 without skipping a beat. So if I get in trouble for that, that's where that came from. Mark was the most bookish person I've ever known. He was a walking, talking encyclopedia of books, a wonder. I think he had a working knowledge of every one of the more than 26,000 adult titles in the store. Stopping by Mark's desk was like getting a sneak preview of everything in publishing. It was more effective than staring at Edelweiss or reading industry blogs. My friend, who I believe is here, Michelle Brofman, a local writer, told me last week that Mark had a superpower. He knew what it was that you wanted or needed to read, even if you didn't know it yourself. She once asked Mark to recommend a novel that she could assign for a class on fiction technique she was teaching at Johns Hopkins, and he put a copy of City of Thieves by David Benioff in her hand. She said it was such a perfect book that she's taught it for years, and she shared that suggestion with another local writer, and she started teaching it in her class, and now that I know that, I think I'll be assigning it too. Such was the influence Mark wielded as a tastemaker and hand seller of books. Ron Tucker, who's P&P's finance director, has probably known Mark longer than anyone in this room apart from Barbara Meade and from his family. And he told me a story about when Mark first came to work here. It was 1997, and Mark had just arrived from Colorado, where he'd been working at a bookstore in Fort Collins. He'd been recruited by Barbara and by Carla Cohen, Politics and Prose's founders. They'd met Mark at a book expo in Chicago and convinced him to come to Washington. Ron and Mark were standing near the front of the store when George Plimpton walked in and asked whether they wanted him to sign any of his books. He was a literary hero to them both, and I'm quoting Ron here. When Plimpton left, Mark turned to me excitedly and said, with his expansive smile, and then Ron amended that and said, an earlier me would have called it his shit-eating grin, I think I can work here. It may very well have been then and there that Mark knew he would never leave Politics and Prose. I love that story, and it's consistent with the Mark that I knew. He told me that he loved his job and that there was nowhere else he wished to be. When we were trying to assemble a list of Mark's favorite books, it was trickier than it might seem, not just because Mark was a voracious reader, but because the books he often talked about had to do with the books he thought that you were going to love, and were not necessarily the books that he loved. But I do know Mark loved the poetry of Lee Young Lee. He once let me borrow his signed copy of The City in Which I Love You. He'd met Lee at a reading in Chicago, and while signed books were probably a dime a dozen for Mark, he seemed to treasure this one. He read me some passages from the title poem, which is beautiful and devastating and haunting, and I can still hear his voice. You are not in the wind, which someone notes in the margins of a book. You are gone out of the small fires in abandoned lots where human figures huddle, each aspiring to its own ghost. Everyone knows and has already heard about Mark's passion for sports. Ron told me that the two of them managed to be friends despite the fact that they did not share the same opinion of the Cubs. But what I loved was how easily his book and sports passions intertwined. Mark and I had been watching the Summer Olympics some years ago when he read that poem aloud, and I'm not going to claim that I have any memory of who had been swimming or what record might have been broken, but I do remember Mark looking up at the screen, the volume of poetry in his lap, and he said, "Give that man a gold medal in iambic pentameter." He had that expansive smile on his face, that shit-eating grin that Ron referred to, and I'm going to miss seeing that when I walk through the fiction room, and I'm going to miss talking to Mark about books.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Michael Triebwasser. I'm a former bookseller and manager here at Politics and Prose, and I'll be doing a reading from All My Puny Sorrows by Miriam Taves, one of Mark's favorites. Just to set the stage a little bit, it's the story about two sisters who love each other very much, who live very different lives. And in this scene, the family is taking the sisters off to the airport. The older sister is going to be traveling off to Europe to study piano to become an accomplished pianist. And this is their conversation in the car. Elf told me that after the poet Shelley drowned, his body was cremated right there on the beach, but his heart didn't burn, so his wife Mary kept it in a small silk bag in her desk. I asked her if it wouldn't have rotted and begun to smell, but she said no, it had calcified like a skull, and really that it was only the remains of his heart. I told her that I would do that for her too, keep her heart with me in my desk or in my gym bag or my pencil case, somewhere very safe. And she hugged me and laughed and told me I was sweet, but really it was a romantic thing for lovers to do. Before she disappeared behind the frosted glass doors of airport security, Elf and I had played one last game of concentration, and in the midst of all that leg slapping and hand clapping, she said, "Swivelhead?" That was her nickname for me because as I was very often looking around for solid clues to what was going on and never finding them, "You better write me letters." I said, "Yeah, I will, but they'll be boring. Nothing happens in my life." "Nothing has to happen," she said, "for it to be life." Well, I said, "I'll try." "No, Yoli," said Elf. "Better than that." She yanked on my arms. "Please, you have to. I'm counting on you." They were calling her flight, and she released her grip. She was pulling away from me. Our parents stood stricken, but acting brave, smiling big, and dabbing at their eyes with tissues. So I said, "I will, okay? Take a chill pill." "All right," said Elf. "I'm out of here. Also, don't say chill pill." "Adieu. Arrivederci." I know she was crying, but she turned her head away at the very last second, so I wouldn't notice, and I thought I should include that in a letter to her under observations of things meant to be hidden. On the way home from the airport, my mother drove, and my father lay in the back seat with his eyes closed. I sat next to my mother in the front. It was snowing. We couldn't see anything except snowflakes in the headlights and a tiny bit of the road ahead. I thought the snowflakes looked like notes and signatures falling and swirling over the little stave of road we can see in front of us, one measure of music. Thank you.
Good evening. It's so nice to see everybody here. Thank you all for coming. Thanks to the Laframboise family and to Brad and Lissa for asking me to say a few words. Mark and I had very similar publishing careers. I started book business in 1986. He started in 1989. I began my independent sales team work with Simon & Schuster in 1998, and as we just heard, Mark started around the same time in 1997 in this store. Our paths started to cross in the early 2000s when I was given responsibility for selling Politics and Prose in stores in the DC area. Back then, reps had what we called a printed catalog. Now, you heard some laughs from those other publisher reps who I see in the room and some of the staff members of the store because everything now is done electronically. Mark, as most of us know, loved to hold and explore the printed catalog. He would rapidly turn the pages, looking for favorite authors and subjects. When the electronic catalog, also called Edelweiss, came along, he was a very reluctant participant. I think that's because, more than most, he not only loved the printed word and pages bound into them, he thrived on them. There are four main areas among many that I want to touch on where Mark's impact was and is still felt. Firstly, at this store. He rose quickly from the staff member to a buyer. His ability to connect was one I encountered and one I heard over and over from other reps. Matter of fact, there are several former staff members who were mentored by Mark who now own their own stores or work for publishing companies. Right? 2, Mark's impact reached into the publishing community. A family of editors, sales managers, executives, and others often reached out to Mark to get his feedback on upcoming titles. That was proved especially true when he got to be named on the National Award Book panel. One of our beloved editors, Nan Graham Scribner, had an ongoing conversation via email with Mark. I reached out to Nan to get a couple comments, and one thing she said to me that really stuck out was when Mark wrote to her, "I really look forward to receiving whatever you are sending." That's the kind of connection that Mark had with people in New York. 3 is impact with other stores and the overall bookselling community. I was honored to serve with Mark for several years on the New Atlantic Booksellers Association board, also called NABA. And I was pleased when Mark was elected president, and he served NABA for 7+ years. Mark was a go-to person when it came for advice, encouragement, ideas, and help to bookstores, not only in New Jersey, from New Jersey to Virginia, but also nationally by participating in panels at Winter Institute and other organizations. He was the guy. 4 is impact on the DC community. Mark's ability to connect with customers and to encourage them to add books to their pile was amazing. We all saw it. He trusted the Politics and Prose customer, and they trusted him. Same with the local authors. Trust was a word I heard often when I spoke to other reps, because I reached out to a lot of my friends to say, "What do you know about Mark?" They were excited, and he trusted the reps that pointed out titles to him, and often he would put table displays of those titles out on the store. Another Mark trait is personable. He's very vested in how each rep was doing. When I brought up the fact that I was volunteering as a track coach, he wanted to know every spring how my kids were doing. How are they doing this year, Tim? To me and to all here, Mark was a friend. A few days after Mark's passing, I received an email from Politics and Prose staff member Suzanne Morgan. And in the email, she stated very eloquently, "We lost our Mark." That phrasing sticks with me because he was and always will be our Mark. So in conclusion, here's a poem I wrote honoring him using Susan's phrasing called "He Left Our Mark on Us." Carla and Barbara saw something, a spark, reached out to Fort Collins and recruited Mark. Young in his mid-30s, with the turn of the phrase, he accepted the challenge and quickly learned the store's ways. A passion for reading and recommending gained the customer's trust. Soon what he discovered became a customer must. The owners did glean he had a knack, so they were secure to promote him to buyer so he could procure. With a wry smile hunched over his desk, just like that, he would tell a rep what would sell best. He was also adept at displays and finding a book on a shelf. Maybe not so good at email, where his unopened file went past 412. The store grew in size, as did his stature in New York. He was often at publishers' dinners, long after work. His desks may be empty, but in his spirit and soul, I suppose, you could say he embodied what it meant to be an employee of Politics and Prose.
Hi, I'm Ruth Liebman from Penguin Random House. Love and sympathy to Mark's family, the family he was born into, and the family of book people he created. This is from an email I sent to Lissa and Brad. I'm going to read. I hope you have some sense of how much he was adored and revered at 1745 Broadway, and before that at the old mothership on East 50th Street. You won't be surprised to hear that he was a favorite of Sonny Mehta, former chairman of Knopf. I got a note from Diana Miller, now a VP in Knopf editorial, but for many years, Sonny's brilliant helper. From Diana, I had the huge pleasure of meeting Mark, and he was such a gent, as someone we know would have said. I remember his astounding support of Richard Flanagan, among others. He truly was a gent. That was clear from the first time I met him, back in the late 90s. We sort of came up together. And when I first started working with indies across the country, the very first trip I made was to Washington, D.C. He was entirely scruffy, but his manners were beautiful. One year, when his birthday was during Book Expo in New York, we took him down to Chelsea for dinner. It was a gorgeous night, and we walked down the High Line with Paul Yamazaki from City Lights and Rick Simonson from Elliott Bay, and I thought, I have the best job in the world, and I get to do it with the best people in the world. We talked about books all night, and being with these three maestros of bookselling was like what I imagine it was to be in Provence in 1970, sharing a kitchen with Julia Child, James Beard, and MFK Fisher. I think if you don't work in New York publishing on a daily basis, it's hard to understand how important the buyers at key indies are to what we do, how respected some of them are, adored really, and how eager even the highest ranking editors are to know what these top buyers think. Why is this? Books get reviewed brilliantly by Ron Charles in the Washington Post, books win Pulitzer Prizes, National Book Awards, books get blurbs from famous writers, authors appear on NPR. But before all of that, while we're waiting to find out if the world is going to love what we're publishing, there are the buyers, and especially the buyers at indie bookstores, and in particular, Mark. In the early days of the book, sure, people like me can love a book, Michael can love a book, Julie can love a book, Ian can love a book, Trudy can love a book, but we get paid to love the books. The author's friends and families can love the books, but you can fill in the blank. So it's really, truly the booksellers who are the first clear signal we hear from the outside world. And among all the brilliant booksellers out there, no one counted more than Mark. When he loved something, it was like a church bell ringing across a great distance. His feedback was so important, and when it came, if he thought a book had magic to it, it really could make a difference in how we decided to launch a book into the world. His fingerprints are all over some of our most admired books. It was no surprise to us in New York that he was named to be a judge for the National Book Awards, because in our world, he had been one of our most important and supportive judges for so many years. And of course, there was a lot of fun. I remember another dinner at a long ago Winter Institute. We were hosting it with Eric Price and Morgan Entricken of Grove Atlantic. I think we were around 30 people, and the restaurant had set us up at a long, narrow table as if it were some kind of royal event. And Mark and I were seated together at one end. And I don't know how many seating charts I've done in my life for author dinners, CEO dinners, Winter Institute dinners, the old Knopf dinners, but I've kept every seating chart I've ever done. And I was looking at them at the other day. I'm clearly a very selfish person because I often seated myself with Mark. At the end of the dinner, they turned up the music, and from the far side of things, Richard Howarth, who owns Square Books in Oxford, Mississippi, dared me to dance down the table with him. It's in Oxford, Mississippi. This narrow table filled with china and glasses and bottles of wine and flowers and candles, real candles with real flames. One doesn't like to say no to Richard, but this definitely was not happening. Mark leaned over and said, "You have to do it." I really didn't want to. I knew I could climb up on the table, but I had no idea how I was going to get down. "I'll catch you," Mark said. So I did it, and it was a total blast. And yes, at the end, I could not figure out how to get down off the table. And Mark caught me, not quite as elegant as Balanchine, but at least I didn't break any bones. And I still hear about this night. And when the story is told back to me, the punchline is basically Richard Howarth can get you to do anything. So I'd like to set the record straight tonight. That is not true. Mark made me do it. I don't believe in the afterlife, but I do like to think that right now, Mark is somewhere with Sonny. I'm not sure what Mark is drinking, but Sonny is having his favorite single malt, Neat. They're talking about the new Patrick Radden Keefe book and whether anyone really cares about deckled edges. They do.
Hello, everybody. My name is Keith Bient. I'm the adult floor manager here at Politics and Prose. Like many of you, I spent most mornings talking with Mark about what books he was reading, what books he loved. So I'm reading a few bits from The Passenger by Cormac McCarthy here, a book that Mark loved and he loved talking about. And as soon as he finished, he shared it with the rest of us booksellers, and this is his copy here I'm reading from. Western slowed. He palmed the water from his face. The kid was becoming obscured in the slashing gusts, slapping along in his outlandish attire. He was wet and chilled. Finally, he stopped. "What do you know of grief?" he called. "You know nothing. There is no other loss. Do you understand? No other loss. None." He'd fallen to his knees in the wet sand. The salt rain blew in off the sea. He seized his skull and called out after that small and shambling figure receding down the beach in the gusts. Lightning flared over the dark water and over the beach and the live oaks and the sea oats and the wall of pines dim in the rain, but the gin was gone. When he woke in the small hours, the storm had passed. He lay there a long time, watching the gray light come up in the room. He got up and went to the window and looked out. Gray day. His wet clothes were piled on the floor, and he picked them up and draped them over the kitchen chairs. Later, he went down to the beach, but the rain had washed everything away. He sat on a driftwood log with his face in his hands. In the spring of the year, birds began to arrive on the beach from across the Gulf. Weary passerines, vireos, kingbirds, and grosbeaks, too exhausted to move. You could pick them up out of the sand and hold them trembling in your palm, their small hearts beating and their eyes shuddering. He walked the beach with his flashlight the whole of the night to fend away predators, and toward the dawn he slept with them in the sand, that none disturbed these passengers. And later, he walked down the street and crossed the railroad tracks, the redness of the evening in the glass of the buildings, very high, a small and trembling flight of geese, fording the last of the day in the thin air, following the shape of the river below. He stood above the bank of riprap, rock and broken paving, the slow coil of the passing water. In the coming night, he thought that men would band together in the hills, feeding their small fires with the deeds and the covenants and the poetry of their fathers, documents they'd no gift to read and a cold to loot men of their souls. Thank you.
My name is Will Haygood. I extend my sympathies to Mark's family. I shop and browse in the bookstore probably 3 or 4 times a week. And across 10 books, many published by Knopf, I would come here and come through the door and make a left and go right to Mark's desk in the aftermath of a snarky book review. And I would say to Mark, "Mark, can you imagine how wrong this person was? How they got it wrong when they said that the book was not quite focused on what it should have been focused on." And I said, "This is really messing with my career." And Mark said, "Yeah, but they also said it was beautifully written." Yeah, but Mark, that's not what I'm talking about. What I'm trying to tell you, man, is that this person is trying to mess up my life. This is what I do for a living. And so it was another book, this one about Thurgood Marshall. And the reviewer was snarky with a capital S. And so I marched right down here and marched right over to Mark and said, Mark, did you read that? I mean, Mark, God, dog, man, there's a conspiracy out there, Mark. And Mark said, yeah, but the last paragraph did say Will Haygood has done an important service to America. And I said, but Mark, no, I'm trying to bring you back to the third paragraph. That was on the front of the New York Times Review. Mark, please listen to me. And so one time, usually my books are, big, thick books, 400 to 500 pages, as Ruth knows. And I broke away and I wrote a little slim book about a White House butler. That got turned into a movie, and there was a review. And the review was fairly vicious because they attacked the book for being so brief. And the title of this book really promises much more than the book can deliver. The Butler, A Witness to History. So I come through the door again. I got to see Mark. And I said, Mark, it's unfair, man. I mean, they know that I just did something quick. This book had to be written fast. And Mark, he folded his arms. He stood up and folded his arms as he was wont to do. And he was leaning back and forth, listening to me. And at the end of my screed, he said, Will, The Butler, #1 at the box office, 26.7 million. Will, I don't think you have any problems. I will miss him forevermore.
Hi, I'm Phil Stanton. I was a member of the Evening Fiction book group here. I was only in the group for a few years, and I probably didn't have the best attendance, but I got some help from some of the more dedicated members, and I hope I can let you know what it was like to take part in the group and to spend an hour with Mark every month. I first heard about the Evening Fiction book group from my mother. That was back when I was still living on the West Coast. When we talked about books on the phone, my mom would tell me about the great books they were discussing in the book group and how much she enjoyed meeting with all the people there and Mark's leadership. When I moved back to DC in 2019, I was finally able to join one of the meetings. And back then, they were in the room downstairs. I was glad I got there a little early because every single seat was taken. Almost all the air was taken, too, with all those people. When COVID hit, the meeting switched over to Zoom, which did change things. We lost some of the old-time members. But we also gained some members from all over the country, and that was a big enrichment for us. Mark didn't run these meetings like a formal setup or like a classroom. He was quite casual, and he had a very light hand in how he ran things. The discussions were among the group, there wasn't a lot of lecturing, and it wasn't just dialogues with the group leader. Mark would start us off with a question, and then sometimes we'd hardly hear from him again for the rest of the hour. Mark made sure that everyone who wanted to speak up had their chance, and he made everybody feel welcome and comfortable. The talks were free form, and they could be quite wide-ranging, sometimes actually kind of chaotic. Mark would speak up more when we ran short of things to say about a book. The books were very wide range. To suit the group, they weren't overly long, not too experimental or far out. I think they tended to be realistic literary fiction. He said that we focused on contemporary fiction, but he defined that to include the last 50 years or so. Some of the books were quite famous, award winners, bestsellers. But the ones I really treasured were pretty obscure. And I found that every month the selection was very high quality, even the ones that I didn't like. I'm so grateful for all the gems that I never would have found on my own. We read recently, had some great discussions about a science fiction book, Station 11 by St. John Mandel. I never thought I'd be reading a Western, but we talked about True Grit. Beautiful book. We read a dog book, The Friend by Sigrid Nunez. And we even heard from a different species with Clara and the Sun. Mark was our literary resource. But more than that, what we got from him were his gentleness, his generosity, his inclusivity, his lack of ego, and the lack of arrogance. We're grateful to Mark for that hour every month.
Good evening. My name is Sandra Beasley. As an author, I was claimed by Mark. I was claimed for this bookstore. I had grown up in the suburbs and moved into the city for graduate school. And when my first poetry book came out, he read it. And when the second one came out, he read it. And I came around and he said, "I like your work." And it was, "We'll support you." No one claims poets. No one wants poets. We're like the ones who you find sleeping in the corner because we can't pay our rent and you have to gently evict them from your bookstore. But he claimed us and he claimed poetry. And I just cannot overstate the meaning of that. I visited him just a few weeks before he passed. We had a long conversation right out there, and there were all these people milling around midday, and I thought, do they know? Do they know who he is? Do they know what he does for this store? It is very difficult for a poet to choose poems for a memorial, and so rather than try to be too on the nose about it, I thought I would simply read the first and last poem from Louise Glick's Winter Recipes from the Collective, a collection of poems that is very much suffused with thinking about mortality. Yeah. Poem. Day and night come hand in hand, like a boy and a girl, pausing only to eat wild berries out of a dish painted with pictures of birds. They climb the high ice-covered mountain, then they fly away, but you and I don't do such things. We climb the same mountain. I say a prayer for the wind to lift us, but it does no good. You hide your head so as not to see the end. Downward and downward and downward and downward is where the wind is taking us. I try to comfort you, but words are not the answer. I sing to you as mother sang to me. Your eyes are closed. We pass the boy and girl we saw at the beginning. Now they are standing on a wooden bridge. I can see their house behind them. How fast you go, they call to us. But no, the wind is in our ears. That is what we hear. And then we are simply falling. And the world goes by, all the worlds, each more beautiful than the last. I touch your cheek to protect you. That's how the collection opens. This is how it closes, going from poem to song. Leo Cruz makes the most beautiful white bowls. I think I must get some to you, but how is the question in these times? He is teaching me the names of the desert grasses. I have a book, since to see the grasses is impossible. Leo thinks the things man makes are more beautiful than what exists in nature. And I say, no. And Leo says, wait and see. We make plans to walk the trails together. When, I ask him, when? Never again. This is what we do not say. He is teaching me to live in imagination. A cold wind blows as I cross the desert. I can see his house in the distance. Smoke is coming from the chimney. That is the kiln, I think. Only Leo makes porcelain in the desert. Ah, he says, you are dreaming again. And I say, then I'm glad I dream the fire is still alive. Thank you.
So there's so many stories about Mark. We could go on telling them all evening, and so many books that he loved, and we could go on reading excerpts from them. But this does bring us to the end of the program. I was thinking during the past hour how Mark would have reacted to all that was being said, and while I'm sure he would have been touched and deeply appreciative, you know, he a part of him might have been squirming as well. And just in the same way, I would see him squirm every week at our senior managers meeting, which, you know, he dutifully attended, but you could tell he would rather be elsewhere. And so, but he knew he had to sit still for an hour. But if we went more than that, a minute longer, you know, he was already halfway up out of his chair. And when I finally would say, okay, that's it, he would go, are we done? And I could hear him a moment ago saying, are we done? And yes, Mark, we're done with this part, but we're not done, and we'll never be done missing you. The store will remain open until 9 o'clock, so feel free to hang around for a while. It is our custom to ask those who come and sit to help our staff by folding up the chairs that you're seated in and putting them against something, you know, that looks sort of solid. If you haven't already, please sign the book of condolences that's over by the information desk. We've had that book there for a number of weeks now, and there are already a lot of comments in there, but we would like to hear from everyone, and then the book is going to go on to Mark's family. And then when you do leave, we hope that you take with you the comforting memories of Mark that you have and that you heard this evening, and the appreciation for books and for talking about them with others. That was so much a part of Mark's life. Thanks for coming.